right, it's Friday, so this is our Pastor's Corner teaching series. Grateful that you can join us. We're going through the minor prophets, the books of the minor prophets in your Old Testament, and this is actually part 3 of the book of Amos. So if you want to, you can take a moment to go catch up with what we've done for the first 3 parts. But if you're catching us now, we're going to be looking at Amos chapter 7, 8, and 9, so to the end of Amos. So I'm going to ask you, if you're joining us here, to pause here and take a moment to read Amos chapter 7 through 9 so that we can go into some of our Bible study here today. So just again, for some quick background reference, we're talking about a person named Amos who was a prophet of God. His profession was he was a shepherd and a fig tree farmer, and he was just commanded and instructed by God to preach this message to the northern kingdom. So King Jeroboam II is the king in charge, and he has put up this temple in Bethel, the place of Bethel, where they have a golden calf, and they're worshiping idols at this point. They're worshiping 3 main idols. They're worshiping the god of fertility, the god of war, and the god of the weather. And so Amos has been instructed to say, because you're worshiping other gods, you no longer know how to treat people right. And one of the big motifs that come out of this book is the very fact that God is a God of justice, and because he requires his people to worship him, they will in turn worship God and treat others well. But when we fail to worship God, we don't treat others well. And as a result, there is now poverty, there's the oppression of the poor who need justice cannot find justice. The rich and the religious continue to get wealthy, and it comes at the expense of those who are considered poor. And so Amos says now, at this point, God's judgment is going to fall on Israel. And so here we have in chapter 7, 8, and 9, what this judgment is going to look like. So in Amos chapter 7 here, we have now Amos not only talking about God's judgment, but now he's going to see God's judgment. So he has a visual picture of what the judgment of God looks like, and so he records them down. So these are visuals for us to also catch and understand how God's judgment will work. And so what he has here in chapter 7 verses 1 to 9 is this idea of this inescapable judgment. And so we have here a locust swarm, scorching fire. Those are the first 2 images. And so in chapter 7 verse 1, it says this is what the sovereign Lord showed me. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested, and just as the late crops were coming up. So this locust swarm is going to come in and devour everything. But in verse 2, we have this. I cried out, Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small. And so in verse 2, Amos pleads to God for mercy. And then in verse 3, it says, so the Lord relented. This will not happen, the Lord said. And so you have verse 1 gives you this indication of what the judgment is, this locust swarm. Verse 2, you have Amos pleading, saying, please God, have mercy. And verse 3, God relents actually from sending this judgment. And this gets repeated again. In verse 4, we have the sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire, and it dried up the great deep and devoured the land. And then in verse 5, we have again, I cried out, Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small. And then verse 6 says, so the Lord relented. This will not happen either. So we have these 2 images of what God is going to do, a locust swarm and this great fire. And then Amos says, please God, don't do that. And then God relents. Now this is just to set us up now. It sets us up for the next thing. So at this point, God has been merciful. He has been allowing Israel to continue. And even as Amos makes his plea, God says, okay, I won't do that. But now here comes the big judgment. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. Verse 7. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plume, with a plume line in his hand. And the Lord asked me, what do you see? A plume line, I replied. Then the Lord said, look, I am setting a plume line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. The high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. With my sword, I will rise against the house of Jeroboam. Now here's the thing. God now gives this image of a plume line. And it's so difficult. It's such a challenge that God is going to wipe out Israel or take them away. Amos doesn't even have the wherewithal to plead for mercy. He's just like, no, God, I can't plead for mercy. Like, what I see here, that's it. there's no point in pleading for mercy, and there's no point at which God relents. So God has been showing mercy to his people, but only for them to continue to be complacent. And now he's saying time is up. And even Amos himself can't even bring himself to plead anymore on behalf. Now, let me just give you an idea. What is a plume line? A plume line is really, it's a string with a weight on the end. And this weight on the end, and so what you would have is you would take the string and you would attach it to a wall. And when you put it on the wall, it would tell you whether the wall is perfectly straight. And so what God is using is this illustration is that Israel, you are so warped. Your wall is so warped that it's not even straight, to the point that it's inevitable that this wall is going to collapse. And Amos sees that Israel is so far off center, so far that collapse is inevitable. And that's what this illustration is here for us to see, is that Israel is so stubborn in their sin of oppressing the poor, of seeking only riches. Amos can't even ask God to relent, and judgment is going to come. You have this interlude here in verse 10 where the priest Amaziah, the religious leader of the time, opposes Amos's prophecy. He says, you know what, like, don't even listen, king, don't even listen to what this guy is saying. And what this reminds me of here is just simply that sometimes we only sometimes like to hear the good and fluffy, nice things that God has for us, blessings and security and comfort. And that's what this priest was all about. He just wanted to hear the nice things. The fact that God was calling out, through Amos, calling out sin and judgment and lack of obedience, and those are harsh things, he was trying to fluff it back and say, oh, no, don't listen to that, don't listen to that. So it's maybe a simple reminder for us. Sometimes the hard things we really do need to lean in and listen to, because it's not supposed to be all just nice and blessing and fluffy stuff. When God says hard things, we really also need to pay attention. Even the priest at this point didn't even want to listen to such a harsh thing. And now we get into chapter 8. Chapter 8 gives us another illustration of God's impending judgment. He says in verse 2, what do you see, Amos? He asked, and he says, a basket of ripe fruit, I answered. Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people. I will spare them no longer. And so here we have this image of this ripe fruit. Now, it's actually what we miss out on in the English is the play on words. It's the idea of summer fruit and the word the end. And so it's poetic. This is all poetic here. And what we have is the word summer fruit and the word the end in Hebrew are actually, they sound very similar. It's like saying see and see, see with your eyes and see as in the body of water. So they sound the same. And so there's a play upon words here where, the last of the harvest, the last summer fruits, as also an indication, Israel, of your end. And so this is the judgment, is that the end is coming for Israel. And in verses 5 and 6, what we see here is this: when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat? Skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with wheat. What you have here is this indictment, right? God is giving the indictment here. You have the new moon and you have the Sabbath. These are supposed to be indicators of worshiping God. But you're so quick to want to get that worship stuff over with and go back to cheating people. You're skimping on the measures. You're boosting the prices of things. You're cheating with dishonest scales. Back in that day, you would measure things and you could weight scales a certain way so that you would make a profit and the other person would be cheated. And you would buy the poor with silver. You would sell people into slavery. And you would even just, for a pair of sandals, you can buy people. And so God is saying, you know what, you have this thing of worship, these moments that you're supposed to worship me, but you're so quick to get that over with so that you can keep abusing people, to keep using people. And the rich were using their wealth to put the poor into slavery. And so Israel, you are rejecting God's worship. You are rejecting God himself. You will now go into exile and there will be nothing more for you there. And so this is where God's judgment is going to come complete. And it will be, his indictment is again, you pretend to worship me, but you treat others this way. You will no longer get away with this. And that leads us into chapter 9. What we have here in chapter 9 is God's big judgment piece here. And it's broken down into two pieces. The first is chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. It's a very negative tone to it. And so God is here saying, I'm not going to read it all, but you can read it yourself. But God is saying all the idols and your worship, your worthless worship in which you try to manipulate me, God, I'm going to shatter the temple that you worship in, and I'm going to demand the sacrifices of your life. And so God is going to judge Israel. Now, one of the things, again, is that King Jeroboam II, he set up a temple in Bethel. And in that temple, he set up a golden calf. And this is where the people were worshiping. They were worshiping other gods, and they were worshiping their riches and their comfort and security. And God says, your worship is now done and over with. And one of his indictments in chapter 5 was that you would even gather in pretending to worship me, even the one true God. But your worship of me was really to try to manipulate me and to get what you want. It's kind of how I liken our prayer life sometimes as Christians. Is we don't spend much time with God. We don't spend much time in his word. We don't spend much time honoring and worshiping God. But we somehow think that through our prayers, if we say it right and we say it well and we say it consistently, somehow we can manipulate God into believing or into giving what we want. Some of us even, I think, approach Christianity this way, that somehow if I give my time and my money to church on a Sunday, God will do what I'm asking of him. And we treat God as nothing more than a vending machine, or we treat God as a genie. Put in something and get something out. And God says, that's worthless worship, and I have no place for that. I have no place for that. And so I will judge that. And he's going to judge Israel for doing that. And he's going to shatter their pagan temples. He's going to demand their lives as a sacrifice instead. But here's the thing. Out of all this doom and gloom, you have the ending of Amos, verses 11 through 15. And I just want to read this one for us as we close out here. In that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and I will rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord who will do these things. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I had given them, says the Lord your God. And so, what is the point of God's judgment? The point of God's judgment on Israel is that eventually there will be restoration. Eventually there will be restoration. And that is a theme of God that we need to always consider as we read these minor prophets. God is going to recognize the covenant he made with David. He's going to recognize the covenant he made with Abraham. That through the line of Israel, there will come someone who will restore everything to the way God intended. He will restore Israel through a future king, the Messianic king. And we know him today as Jesus. And in fact, he's going to restore the world through Jesus, through Israel. That will include all the nations of the world. And so in verse 12, all the nations that bear my name. And so it's no longer going to be just one specific group, but all peoples will come to know God, and God will restore everything to the way he wants it to be. So one of the big themes about this book is really we have to look carefully at God and understand these characteristics. God, who is a God of justice and a God of mercy. These two things go hand in hand with God. Because really, the reality is, if God is good, he has to confront and do something about evil. He cannot allow evil to just run rampant. If he did, he wouldn't be a good God. But at the same time, so he has to confront Israel's evilness. He has to confront the nation's evilness. He even confronts our evilness as well. But his long-term plan always is to restore the people and restore the family and restore the kingdom itself. And he will do that. And he does that through Jesus Christ as Jesus initiates and inaugurates God's kingdom. Now he commands the church, now you and me, to be part of that kingdom purpose, to be part of that kingdom plan to restore things to the way God had originally intended. So He needs to deal with evil with justice, but he also deals with us with mercy, that there will be a time where he restores everything. And so that's the book of Amos. So what are some of our takeaways? I want to give you two big takeaways from this entire book. So what is our takeaway? I want to offer to you two very simple takeaways from this entire book of Amos. The first is this: to truly worship God will always lead us down paths of justice, righteousness, and loving others. To truly worship God will always lead us down paths of justice, righteousness, and loving others. The whole premise of this book is that people were worshiping God, but they were worshiping him to manipulate him. They were worshiping him and they were mistreating people. They were oppressing the poor. They were not giving them justice. They were not giving them mercy. They were using and abusing. And this is not loving others. And so if you really truly understand who God is, if you truly worship God, if you truly love God, you will also embrace what God is passionate about. He's passionate about justice, and he's passionate about righteousness, and he's passionate about compassion and care and love for other people. And so for us as followers of Jesus, this is one of the great things that we're called to. If we truly worship this God, it leads us down these paths of justice and righteousness and loving others. And so we are the ones called to be at the front lines of loving others in our community. We're called to be the ones to advocate for the poor. We're called to be the ones to advocate for justice and things to be right. We're called to be the ones to deal with racial inequalities. We're called to deal with issues of race, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Indigenous peoples, whether it's people of color. Christians, we're called to that. We're called to take up God's purposes and God's passions with regards to justice, righteousness, and loving others. The second thing then that I think that's kind of tied to this is that our elaborate worship of God can sometimes be an insult if we have no mind to obey God after the fact. Sometimes we have these elaborate worship services. Now, given our current situation now where we've simplified a lot of our services to be online simply because of COVID. But, there are many times where we come and we want to put on these great productions and lights and good music and fog machines and all these different things, these elaborate ways to worship God. But they are nothing more than an insult to God if we leave churches and if we leave these worship services and we're not called any longer to obey God. If you go to a worship service and it's got great music and a great sermon, but you leave and you go back to living the way you always live and you mistreat others and you don't think about God at all during the rest of your life, that worship is nothing more than an insult to God. And I think those words from Amos 5 are really, really telling for us. If you and I don't go about obeying God in our day-to-day life, why did you bother worshiping God on Sunday? And I think that is one of the greatest indictments of the book of Amos. Because the people, they would go to their day-to-day lives. They would seek after money. They would seek after comfort. They would seek after security. And they would worship God as a way to manipulate him. My challenge to us as always, do you really worship God? Do you really know who he is? Because if you really do, you will go out and live the way he's called us to live. But if there's a disconnect between how we live Monday to Saturday and what we do on Sunday, what we do on Sunday is nothing more than an insult to God. So I hope that's a challenge and encouragement at the same time. Something for us to really consider. Our elaborate worships can be nothing more than an insult if we fail to obey God every day of our life. Well, that's the book of Amos. Thanks for joining our series here. We're going to continue looking through the minor prophets, and our next stop will be in the book of Hosea. So until then, love and peace. We'll see you again next week.